They're not like the hard deer that you get in the bush back home in New Zealand. They're really soft, really soft.
Well, one of them ate my map the last time I went there, so yeah, they're pretty hard.
Michael, how do you want me to introduce you?
Man that keeps the wheels running, grease between the cogs, the best smelling member of...
Hello, everyone. My name is Yulin, and I'm here for another episode of KED Talks. I'm here today with Alex Bennett, who is a professor at Kansai University. He's also the author of Bushido, as well as translator of many works, including the Book of Five Rings. He's got an upcoming book on the memoirs of a former kamikaze pilot. And we're also here with Michael Ishimatsu-Prime, who is a frequent contributor to Kendo World magazine. He's one of the guys who keeps the whole thing running. The fact that we still are able to publish issues at all is largely due to his work. He has an MA in Japanese Language and Society, and some of his recent work includes the translation of Hirakawa Nobuo Sensei's book, Kendo, Fundamentals and Waza to Win. So thank you guys for agreeing to come on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Alex is joining us from the woods, or I guess coronavirus has taken over your living room, so the wild animals have come in as well.
No, I just set up camp in Nara Park, you see. I'm gonna cook myself some venison later on.
They are quite tame. I love the signs they have there of like the deer molesting tourists, right? Like knocking over old ladies, stealing candy from young kids.
Oh yes, they're very assertive. And they're sort of like being hand-fed their whole lives on these really horrible sort of crackers.
Shikasembe is what I believe they're called.
Shikasembe, is that what they are? Yeah. So they're not real deer. They're not like the hard deer that you get in the bush back home in New Zealand. They're really soft, really soft.
Well, one of them ate my map the last time I went there, so yeah, they're pretty hard.
Right. And we're not here to talk about deer, though. We're here to talk about sort of translating in general. You guys have done quite a lot of translating, both from Japanese to English and English to Japanese, in particular of martial arts related stuff. What are some of the challenges you find in translating martial arts related material?
Particularly, you have to think about what your audience is really. Obviously, with the Kendo Fundamentals and Waza to Win, Hirakawa Sensei's book, it's all for Kendoka. And most likely the people that are reading that have done Kendo before. So
a bunch of stuff you can not translate and just be like...
Yeah. So you have to think about the different words that are being used and just exactly how much you actually need to translate. So if you see what I mean, there's a lot of vocabulary, a lot of words that we all use that a person who does Kendo does know, so you don't really need to translate them. But if it's something more historical or more cultural or something like that, then you have to go a lot deeper into the translation. You probably need to annotate it, as Alex has done with several of his works. So first of all, you have to really think about what your audience is and who's going to be reading it, and then kind of adjust your translation based on that. Obviously, with something like Alex did recently, Gorin no Sho, he would have had to have got a lot deeper into the meanings of some of the words and things like that than I would have had to, or that I did for Hirakawa Sensei's book.
A lot of the works that people tend to think of are in sort of classical Japanese, which I guess bears as much relation to modern Japanese as Shakespearean English does to modern English.
I think also, just to touch on what Michael was saying there, the way in which you approach the translation will vary greatly depending on whether it is a work, a classical work, which is more literature, as opposed to a teaching manual, a technical manual. So, for example, the the book that Michael did recently. This book is primarily a book about, well, basically technical know-how, isn't it, Michael? It's
Yeah, so here's the book. But yeah, as Alex said, it's mostly technical, but there is a few pages at the beginning with a little bit of history about kendo, but generally probably 98% of it is all technical.
Hey, Michael, I just found a spelling mistake in the cover.
Where? Yeah, good one, good one.
It would be quite embarrassing. Like we go through so many of these like revision and grammar and spelling checks with each one of our books. Like it's incredible. Like how many revisions do you guys like go through past the initial translation?
I think for that book, the very first one I did, and then I went through it all again. And then I sent it to Alex, and Alex made some corrections. Then it got
some corrections.
Yeah, just a couple, and then it got laid out, and then I went through it again just to make sure that, because sometimes when the text is laid out, like words get cut in strange places, and maybe the body of text is wrong for the picture that it's supposed to be describing. Because also there were, I think, 1,300 photographs that had to go into that book as well. So you got all the captions for that. So I had to go through and check that they were all right. Then a proof got made of that. Then a gashgu, where there was me, you, and me and Yulin and a couple of the other boys went through it all again. Then I had to put all of them changes back into the InDesign files, printed it out again, and then went through it again. And then I believe Alex went through it one more time after that, I think. So
at least, I think. I remember just being shocked at just how many times you guys, we go through a single article.
Yeah, and also with that book in particular, you have to make sure as well that all the words are rendered in the same way, and that the same terms of phrasing are the same way. The hyphens are used in the same way. One thing that we've got that we often use as a base, as a reference, is the All Japan Kendo Federation's Japanese to English dictionary.
Which I translated, by the way.
Yeah, which Alex translated. I imagine that was quite easy as well.
Simple, mate, simple.
So we kind of use that. So for a lot of the terminology, that we'll use that as a base to how the words are being written in English. But yeah, it was I think probably by the time I'd finished the translation, it was probably another year of different layouts, and several months at least anyway, of printing it out again. And then if there's one mistake that I see with the way a certain word is rendered, then I'll have to go through the whole document to make sure that all of those are then consistent all the way through.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's probably still a couple of things in there.
There always is, man. They stand out like dogs' balls once it's printed, right? But one of the really difficult things with whether it be a piece of classical literature or a teaching manual like the Hirakawa Sensei book that you translated is often the translation will be correct, because as a translator, first and foremost, you're trying to make sure that the content is being conveyed correctly. But a very easy trap to fall into is the trap of chokuyaku, okay, or direct translation. So for sure, the content is accurate, but it's not natural English anymore. It's sort of, but as a translator, often you don't get that, you don't see that, because you know in your mind what it's supposed to be, and you're so focused on getting it right that you miss the very obvious strangeness in the English that it comes out in. And that's where people who are reading it for the first time, they'll pick up on all sorts of stuff, and they'll say, what the hell are you trying to say here? And that's when you have to go through and rewrite it. And that will, in the process of translating this whole book, without realizing it, you've created all these really strange phraseologies and weird ways of of putting things, and you have to go through and change it all again. And that knocks certain things out of kilter in your own mind, which means you have to go through and try and even it out and well, polish off the edges, buff the edges a little bit. So,
but sometimes it sounds like that those like weird phrasing is sometimes what people seem to be looking for, right? I've seen criticisms of translations being like, this seems too colloquial.
Too colloquial.
As in like maybe not of yours, but or maybe even of yours. Like we're talking the Book of Five Rings. There's many places where you, instead of literally translating the exact like phrase or the words as they're written, you chose a more, say, modern alternative, to make it more readable.
And therein lies the art of translation, I think. Google Translate, or even Microsoft Word Translate these days, does a pretty good job at sort of getting the main points and the keywords across. But the real art of translation is understanding what it is that the author, the original author, is trying to say, and not only putting across the information that's in the text accurately, but putting it across the way in which the author, the original author, would want it to be put across. So when you read a lot of these classical Japanese texts, like Gorin no Sho, for example, Hagakure, Koyo Gunkan, they actually are quite colloquial in their original forms. But you would not know it was colloquial unless you really knew a lot about that period. You know a lot about the language of that period. You know a lot about the culture and the social and political background of that period. And you can try and, I mean, it's impossible to do it, 100% right, but try and put yourself in the shoes of the original author. And that's one of the big issues that I have with books like Miyamoto Musashi's Gorin that have been translated by other translators, not only from Japanese to English, but before that, from classical Japanese into modern Japanese. And just because it's a Japanese person who's it's basically translating it, like you said before, about Shakespearean English into modern English. The problem with that is, especially with, our field is really, related to Japanese martial culture, Bushido, Budo, martial arts. A lot of the modern renditions in Japanese of these classical texts have been done by experts in literature. They treat the actual book, or the original work, or the original treatise as a work of literature, when actually Gorin no Sho by Miyamoto Musashi is actually not that different to Hirakawa Sensei's book. It was just written a few hundred years before. It's more or less a kind of a technical manual in many respects, something that he wanted to pass on to his students. So in that sense, it's not necessarily a work of literature. And so when somebody who doesn't know anything about Bujutsu, or about, samurai culture, but knows a lot about classical Japanese and literature, translates it, you miss a lot of those finer nuances. Perhaps you miss a lot of the colloquialisms as well. So when I translate, particularly these older texts, it's much harder in that respect, but it's also a lot more satisfying. I try and put myself in the shoes of the author rather than serve as a go-between. And because of that, sometimes naturally these colloquialisms come out. Whether they're absolutely 100% accurate or not, I would say they are, of course, but other people may take issue with it. But I am trying to feed off my own experience and sort of transport myself back in time into in the case of Miyamoto Musashi's Gorin no Sho Musashi. But I had a very strange, disturbing experience when I was translating Hagakure for this very reason. Now, Hagakure, I don't have a copy of my...
It's right by your head.
Oh, is it? There.
The big red one.
It's right here. I was asked by Tuttle to translate this, and I started translating it. Of course, there are already a number of translations, English translations, other languages other than English, and also modern Japanese translations. And it's really interesting. You look at the modern Japanese translations, they're all quite different as well. And so the way in which you interpret what is being said really depends a lot on your own personal background and how well you can sort of maneuver yourself into the position of the original author, or as close as you can to the context of that time. And coming from a martial arts background, a kendo background, I have insights that are different perhaps to the literature professor in a Japanese university who's looking at it, as I said, like I said before, as a work of literature. But looking at it from a martial artist, a lot of stuff makes sense to me that probably wouldn't make sense to somebody who's never done classical Japanese martial arts or even modern Japanese martial arts. And when I started translating Hagakure, I was sort of making, relatively steady progress, but there's certain bits where I'd get stuck. And I mean, I'd get stuck on a paragraph or a sentence that'll take me a whole day to get my head around, because I'd work out, in the scheme of things, this one sentence is actually quite pivotal, because everything that comes before it and everything that comes after it sort of relates to that. And so if I get that wrong, then it's going to throw everything out of kilter, and my interpretation would have been mistaken. So you have to take care, and sometimes you get stuck. And it got to the stage where I was obsessing with, even the smallest phrase, and it was starting to do my head in. After I got about half of the book done, I had this dream. Now, I know this sounds weird.
It does.
And I've only had one glass of whiskey.
Well, for those of you watching, we've decided that these probably will go a little bit smoother with if everyone's got some sort of drink in their hand. So
yes, you're right.
Here's everyone.
Yes, it's helping me access those suppressed memories. But I had a dream of Yamamoto Tsunetomo, who's the old geezer in Hagakure. He's the orator, basically, and his kohai, Tashiro no Tsunamoto, he was the guy that sort of wrote down Yamamoto Jocho, or Tsunetomo's words, as he was relaying them. And Yamamoto Jocho came to me in this dream, and he said, "Boy, bollocks, what the hell are you doing?" I can't remember if it was in Japanese or English, but yeah, he was a bit pissed off with me. He says, "You haven't listened to a word I've said." Now, this is true, man. This is what he said to me when I woke up, and I remember this, and it's like, Jesus, I just got berated by Yamamoto Jocho. You haven't listened to a word I've been saying. That translation is bullshit. Stop it now. And it's like, oh my God. It freaked me out. I sort of woke up in a cold sweat, and it freaked me out. And I looked at all the stuff I'd translated, and it's like, to use the Japanese word, it's very katai. It's like very rigid, and it's
very hard, very stiff.
Yeah, it's not natural. And then I remember what Yamamoto Jocho sensei said to me in my dream. You haven't listened to a word I've been saying, and that was the spark. It's like, bloody hell, yeah. Because you think about it, the way that book came about in the early 1700s was Yamamoto Jocho lived in a little mountain hut in Saga Prefecture. He'd retired from being a samurai for various reasons. If you buy the book, you'll know why. And he had his kohai Tashiro no Tsurumoto would come and visit him over the course of 7 years. You'd walk into the forest where Yamamoto Jocho was living. I've actually been there before the book was published, because I figured I had to breathe the air, I had to drink the water, I had to drink the sake, as I spill it, of where Yamamoto Jocho lived. And when you think about it, human beings, we have good days and we have bad days, right? I'll wake up this morning, I'll be feeling tired. I'll wake up tomorrow and I'm energized and I'm really positive. And the next day I might be a little bit grumpy. The day after that I might be quite playful. Everybody's different, and you have your rhythms. You think this Hagakure was written over the course of Tashiro no Tsurumoto visiting his senpai over 7 years, and it's like some days are going to be good, some days are going to be bad. And when you're reading Hagakure in the original, some of it is like really nasty. Some of it's really actually quite funny, but it doesn't make sense, because certain sections you have this very serious tone, and other sections it's like, seems like it's taking the piss, and it's like contradicting itself. And I realized, like what Yamamoto Jocho said to me in this dream, you are not listening to what I'm saying. In other words, you're just translating text. You're not translating my words. You're not translating my mind. And the clue that he gave me, and I know this sounds weird, guys, I'm not ill, okay, I know it sounds weird, but the clue that he gave me is like, you have to approach this book as if I am talking to you, exactly how I was talking to Tashiro no Tsurumoto. And if I listen to you, well, if I listen to him, as it were, just like Tashiro did when he wrote down the words for Hagakure, he was listening and interpreting the way that it resonated with him. It's not.
He's not transcribing. He's listening, and then he's going home, and the next day he's writing out. I think that's what that guy said.
Exactly. And so once I worked that out, it's like, it actually wasn't that difficult. It wasn't that contradictory at all. And one thing I'd like to do with Hagakure, and many of the books like it that I've translated, is I'd like to go through each little vignette and put an emoji in there, like a smiley emoji or a grumpy emoji or a surprise emoji or a, whatever. Because each one of them, each section is like different. It's representing a different kind of mood. And the only way that you can really get to that essence of it is to be colloquial, because human beings are essentially colloquial. And so this is why I think translation, especially in Japan, is often really underrated as a skill. It's like, oh, you just change the words around, where it's not that at all. It's really getting into the mind, into the heart of the original author, and trying to convey the essence of what they were trying to convey.
Well, what about you, Michael? Have you been visited by any ancient samurai in your dreams?
Doesn't Hirakawa Sensei live around the corner?
Well, actually, yeah, he just lives 5 minutes drive away from me, but no, I've not been visited in dreams by anyone. I think that's just you, Alex.
Sorry, mate.
But what about the process then?
But I can see how, like, if you're saying it's very colloquial, if you were to translate it very or output it very colloquially, there would be some people, I imagine, that would be, oh, but this is a great martial arts text. Why are you putting it in such kind of rough language? You're not doing it right. I imagine them kind of comments would follow if you do something.
Yeah, but my comment back would be, okay, you translate it then.
Well, I mean, a lot of people think they can do a better job, right? They're like, oh, I've learned a little bit. I know what all the words in here in the sentence mean.
Yeah.
Doesn't this word actually mean this? I remember reading what was it, a section on. I was browsing through the Book of Five Rings before this, and there was one about stepping on the sword, like kenfumu, right? I think some people translate it as like trample. You translate it as step, but you could translate it as like just like tromp, or something very 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 much colloquial, right? And it wouldn't be wrong.
No, that's the whole point. The language that's used is actually colloquial. Okay. Like Musashi's language, Yamamoto Jocho's language, Koyo Gunkan's Yamanashi. Well, in those days it was
Shakespeare. I mean, I hate to keep harping on this example, but right, Shakespeare is written in the colloquial English of the time. It's not the language of the educated, like literati class that he's using, even though that's sort of the impression we get, right?
And the other thing you got to keep in mind when we're talking about classical samurai texts, the dialect is really important, because the various domains had a very strong sense of, I guess you could call it a kind of national identity, and their language was also very different. So you're looking at different regions, they purposefully use a different kind of language or a different.
Well, I mean, it's like what old Germany, right before unification, right? You identify as a samurai from this domain, not a samurai from Japan. There's no such, or there's not really as strong a concept of that in your mind, right?
Yeah, that's right. And not only that, it gets even more difficult when you sort of peel away the layers, especially of the older samurai texts. Is not only you're talking about the language variation in terms of the region and the era, but also with regard to, the way things are written or put down depends largely on who that message was being written for. So you've got this kind of joge, you've got this hierarchical thing going on as well. So when we talk about samurai, bushi, for example, people often seem to think that bushi were just a group of professional warriors, but within the samurai society, there were a lot of different ranks, and it was very hierarchical, and the way in which things were conveyed or expectations were often very different even within that samurai group.
Yeah, you'd have your nobility all the way down to people who were technically samurai but really were just farmers.
Yeah, just like Michael over there, sort of thing.
just a riffraff. That's me.
Well, like Oda Nobunaga, right? I think his or what? No, Nobunaga was aristocracy.
Yeah, Hideyoshi.
But Hideyoshi was basically like a jumped up peasant as far as they were like technically samurai.
He's your classic rags to riches sort of story, basically.
The cannon fodder rank of your samurai who was disdained by all the
this one here, everybody.
Is that a plug, Alex? Sorry, just
You move from the woods of Nara into the woods of your own self-regard.
That's a plug, Michael.
So let's shift tack a little bit from the classical stuff. But what's some of the most difficult stuff that you've had to translate, and why was it so difficult?
Are you talking to me or Michael?
Let's start with Michael.
Well, in terms of volume, Hirakawa Sensei's book, because it was a huge amount. But through Kendo World, we've done a lot of stuff for the All Japan Kendo Federation, the Japanese Academy of Budo, Nippon Budokan, Tsukuba University, things like that. But when, particularly with the stuff for the All Japan Kendo Federation, when it's rules or official stuff, say for example about World Kendo Championships or Shiai Shimpan rules or whatever, then a lot of the translation there will go to a committee and every word is poured over. And again, as Alex has said, when you've read a piece of text.
It's about a committee checking your translation.
Yeah. And with members of the All Japan Kendo Federation that are excellent English speakers, you know, so that, but yeah, it's a whole committee will then pour over each phrase, and I get that because, well, I wasn't involved on the dictionary, but I earlier on this year did stuff for information coming out about the new the next World Kendo Championships, and some of them were slight like updates to rules and other official things like that. So you have to make sure that it also matches the phraseology that's used on previous documents as well that I haven't had access to. So you do the translation, send it off. Oh, can you use this phrase instead? Can you use this? So that can be quite tricky, and with documents like that can be so much, you know, backwards and forwards.
Yeah, consistency. I mean, I think I talked about it earlier. Is actually really difficult in translation because you would expect the same phrase or the exact same sentence, which might get repeated in multiple. It should be translated the exact same way, but it's hard to remember that. Oh yeah, I wrote it exactly this way when I translated it before.
Or especially if, you know, we weren't involved in the original one, maybe then we have to base it on the original English that was done by someone else, maybe, but for consistency it all has to go through. So that can be quite difficult as well, especially when some words in English maybe it could mean, you know, one thing or another. There could be a couple of different meanings as well. But
can you give some specific examples? Not to put you on the spot or anything,
off the top of my head, no.
All right.
Well,
fair enough.
I remember sometimes context is always a tricky one, isn't it? And so just to give you a very simple example, a few years ago, my brother Blake and I were asked by the All Japan Kendo Federation to translate the pamphlet that they had just put out in Japanese about anti-doping in Kendo. This was after Kendo, the International Kendo Federation became affiliated with Sport Accord. So they have to comply with WADA anti-doping rules. And this is something that people in Kendo had never thought about before. I mean, Kendo, you don't have retirement. You go until you're 80, 90, 100 years old if you can still stand up and hold a stick, which means that a fair proportion of the active Kendo population in Japan are taking drugs of some sort to keep alive, be it blood pressure or heart pills or whatever, right? And so anyway, we had to translate this this document into English, even though it was put out by the All Japan Kendo Federation for people in Japan. The Federation figured that, well, this obviously is going to affect international Kendo as well, like the World Championships and so forth. So we better put an English one out. So the stage where we translated, it's all, you know, we're talking about anti-doping, the common sense is the same everywhere in the world. There's certain things you're allowed to do and there's certain things you're not allowed to do, and there's certain procedures that you have to follow. But then it started talking about, the kind of food that you can eat or should eat, and kind of food that you shouldn't eat, and the sort of food that's good before shiai, and
so it wasn't just like an anti-doping thing. It also turned into like a sports nutrition.
You got it. And then it started saying, you know, things like kushikatsu and tonkatsu and blah 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 blah.
Are basically fried things on sticks, or fried pork cutlets, like deep fried breaded stuff. That's
right. And so because there was a focus very much on the Japanese way of life, the Japanese diet, and the things that are available in Japan, simple question: do we translate it as it is in the Japanese for the international community, and say, yeah, watch out for tonkatsus and kushikatsus and
eat more of the takuan pickles, or
and you know, there's a lot of carbohydrates and rice and blah blah blah. Okay, of course, right? But that is not necessarily applicable to somebody who lives in, I don't know, the Netherlands, or I don't know, the Dutch West Indies, you know. So how true do we stay to the original translation, or how much room do we have to make some sort of changes to make it more applicable to a wider audience that's not necessarily restricted to the Japan scene? And interestingly, Michael mentioned the committees. The committees are a pain in the ass because you've got all these senseis who don't really understand English so much, but they'll be able to pick out words here and there that don't match the words in the original Japanese, and they'll immediately assume that this is an incorrect translation, this is no good. And so you sort of had to
Well, they
spend...
fall into that trope, yeah, the direct translation sort of fallacy. Like, I know the translation. I mean, in some of the Patreon chats we've done, right, you talked about the translation of the word ken, right, whether that should be translated as sword or katana or all that, and a lot of it's mistakenly translated as katana a lot of the time when you should use the more generic word sword.
Yep, exactly. Like even in the official concept of kendo, which was created in 1975, it says that kendo, we study kendo, or we develop our character through studying the principles of the sword. Unfortunately, the original English has principles of the katana. Okay, but the Japanese doesn't use the word katana at all. It uses the word ken, which is written with a completely different kanji, which means tsurugi. And so...
Which means like a generic sword, whether it be single-edged, double-edged, curved, straight.
Well, no, actually it means double-edged sword. And therein lies an incredibly important underpinning philosophy of what we're doing in kendo. That's why we call it kendo, not todo or katana do, right? Because it's the double-edged sword. In other words, the sword that you use to fight against your opponent, but at the same time, the blade is also pointing towards you. So ultimately, the philosophy behind kendo is that before you cut the evil from your opponent, which is what we're essentially doing with sword fights, and what you do with a katana, because it's a single-edged blade, it goes one way, right? Philosophically speaking, we should also have a blade pointing towards ourselves, so that we can also think about our own deportment, our own character, our own inherent evil, our own inherent good, and so on and so forth. This is the philosophy behind the official concept of kendo, but that was mistranslated from the outset because it missed the point. Instead of saying tsurugi or ken, double-edged sword, it just immediately assumed that the best way to translate that into English is katana, because everybody knows what a katana is, and let's face it, it's Japanese swordsmanship. Big problem. And if
one of the great unspoken ironies that, you know, kendo is named after a type of weapon it doesn't technically use.
Exactly. Or even the way we write shinai. Okay, for the bamboo swords that we use. Ta-da!
For anyone who's watching who's not familiar with kendo.
Which is another good point about translation, assuming that the person who's reading it generally doesn't know what the hell you're talking about, and to help them understand it. But this is, we use this in kendo, right? A shinai. Okay, it's written bamboo katana, if you use the kanji. So again, if we're using a bamboo katana, why do we call it kendo instead of todo or katana do? So these are the sort of things that, unless you're really immersed in that kendo culture, you will not be able to convey the hidden meaning. You won't be able to read between the lines and therefore work out the best contextual way of expressing the essence of what it is that you're translating.
So you guys probably also have to spend a lot of time, I guess, or encounter a lot of other people's translation of martial arts texts and that kind of stuff. At the risk of maybe, well, let's try, maybe not name specific names, but what are some translations or ways of translating things that really irritate you guys? Like mistranslated phrases or styles of translation?
I don't think it's things that are necessarily irritate, or not phrases that are irritating, but it's maybe from someone that doesn't have a background in kendo or other martial arts, then translating a martial arts text. So, for example, recently we did, or a couple of years ago now, we did Shigematsu Sensei's book that became the Kendo Mind, A Guide to Grading, and it was translated very well by someone that we know, but unfortunately that person doesn't have a background in kendo. So a lot of the phrases for maybe techniques and concepts that kendo practitioners are very familiar with were actually sort of translated. What's something like, for example, men kai shido, like men returning to do. Obviously, if someone that knows kendo wouldn't need that kind of, would understand men kai shido, wouldn't need
it to be translated. You could leave it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's things like that, and it's not, and it's not things that are done deliberately or or viciously or whatever, but it's that can be kind of hard to get around sometimes when someone has done something that doesn't really know kind of the world that we inhabit. And it would be exactly the same, I think, that if we were suddenly to get a job translating something about kabuki theater or no or something, we don't really have we could look at the text and we could translate it, I'm sure, but we wouldn't know the nuances or the backgrounds for certain concepts within kabuki or anything really like that. That's what can be difficult.
Yeah, one thing, that's ultimately the job of the editor to sort of sort that out, right? But one thing that what doesn't irk me, but it's an easy trap to fall into. There's two things actually, and I'm only bringing this up because it's something that after translation is something that some people are naturally good at it. But there's not many people. It's something that you develop your skill over many years and over many projects, and you start seeing the various pitfalls and the traps that you fall into. And then you start reading other people's translations, and you can see why they've translated that way, because you would have done that the same way once, but now you know a little bit more because you've done more translations. So it becomes more refined and more polished, and it becomes more compact as well. So one of my important rules is to try and avoid repetition as much as possible, and also to cut back on words, even if it's written in Japanese in a certain way. Make sure that you strike man with a very big movement, whatever. Okay, let's just say strike man big. Okay, well, obviously that brings me on to my next point. Okay, is I think you'll find yourself doing this too, Michael. I do it all the time when I translate from Japanese into English, or I translate from English into Japanese. I have to be quite careful. So, and the reason I have to be careful is because I have to get my mind synced with the language that I'm going to be translating into. And so if I'm translating from Japanese into English, I will usually spend about 30 minutes reading a book in English, or vice versa when I'm starting to if it's a significant body of work that I'm doing, I'll do my warm up in my brain, okay, my linguistic warm up, because if I don't do that, I've discovered after living in Japan for 30 years that my thought process is really a jumbled mix of English and Japanese grammar and word order. And I'll find when I put something down on paper and I read it later, it's like, oh my God, this English is written exactly how I would be speaking Japanese, with the verb and the subject and object and so on.
Yeah,
all over the
mixed up.
Yeah, and vice versa. When I write Japanese, I'll write Japanese exactly how I would be speaking in English in a way, and it becomes very gruff and very straight and possibly a little bit rude. So I have to get my brain into the right sort of linguistic context, if you like, before I start. And I see that a lot when I read other people's translations. Clearly, that person has done an accurate job, but their word order, the way they express various terms and stuff is clearly a very jumbled mix of both languages, and it's not very clear. So anybody who's not au fait with the subject or the languages will find it quite confusing to read. Whereas if we read it, or I read it, it makes perfect sense because that's how my brain is operating in the first place.
I think that was one of the things that you after I'd done the first several pages or chapters of Hirakawa Sensei's book, I sent it to you, and you did some checking on it with the edit function on Microsoft Word, and it came back and it was just so dramatically short on many of the sentences. And I was just after that, oh yeah, I don't need to use that many words. And that was a really big learning experience, because you're inhabiting this world of this book for such a long time. You're thinking, oh, it's a big responsibility. I've got to get this sensei's thoughts over to people that can't read it in Japanese, and then I want to make sure that I'm getting everything that he's saying on the page in English. But then there's no need for a lot of it to be, as you said, a chokuyaku or direct translation. Just
a lot of superfluous stuff, right?
Well, there's a bit of there's a bit of tension, right, between, I think, getting the correct meaning across, which often just needs to be a very short sentence, versus getting all of the potential nuance in there. But a lot of times, maybe some of that potential nuance isn't really important.
Yeah,
I like the fact that they're using some flowery elocution to express the idea.
But then you have the opposite problem as well, which I find I have this sometimes crop up with my translation work, but also my interpreting, particularly with my interpreting.
Yeah. I've seen it happen.
Yeah. So a simple example is like, yes, in the Edo period, the onoha itoryu was one of the main styles of swordsmanship that was patronized by the shoguns. Okay, that would be the direct translation from Japanese to English. But if I'm talking to a whole lot of people who come into Japan for the first time, in the Edo period, which was from 1603 through to 1868, time of peace, following the warring states period where samurai culture developed immensely, there was a style of classical swordsmanship called the onoha itoryu, which was highly popular among the high-ranking levels of samurai, including the shogun, who was essentially the top of the government. Okay, so I've just turned a 10-second sentence into a 1-minute diatribe. But without that extra information, depending on who the audience is, nobody will understand what the hell the Edo period is, onoha itoryu is, and what the shoguns are. So you sort of have to read the situation or the audience and kind of embellish certain areas to make sure that the message gets across. So sometimes it's a balancing act. Sometimes you have to embellish, and sometimes you have to read between the lines, and sometimes you just have to cut out all the shit. So
I know there's people who give me very suspicious looks at some of these interpreting, right, where your answer is either much longer or much shorter than what the person was.
That's actually something that I was just dealing with a couple of days ago for a client. Can you look at was it the second or third to last paragraph? The English looks a lot longer than the Japanese and a lot of more information in it. But what it was is that in the original Japanese spoke about, and it would be very simple in Japanese, so that the suffix jutsu was changed to do. So kenjutsu became kendo. So obviously you would write that in English, but then obviously someone that's just coming to kendo or budo for the first time, or even if it's intended for someone that doesn't do martial arts, they will have no idea really what does this jutsu and do thing mean. So we had to put in a slight explanation afterwards, and that's why the paragraph was longer. So I had to explain to the client that, oh well, this is why, because they're unlikely to someone that has not much experience in martial arts would probably not understand what this move from kenjutsu to kendo is. So that's why we needed to put in a little explanation. And then also the word michi or do in Japanese has so many great connotations, and such a lot embedded in just that one character, that just also to write that in English as way, again, that doesn't really do it justice. So we needed to explain that. I think it was also emphasizes the spiritual or educational aspects of the art, which is what made that paragraph much longer than the original Japanese, but for the sake of clarity.
You just reminded me of a a bit of a complicated issue that I've been working on myself for the last few months. At the moment I'm in the process of translating this book for the Nippon Budokan. It's a big bugger.
So that book title is it's a karate book.
It's a karate book. It's 550 pages. It's the history of karate basically, and interestingly, karate history in Japan, it's not that old. And that it only came to Japan in the 1920s from Okinawa. But the history, or the understanding of history, even among Japanese practitioners, is quite sort of not really in line with each other, because you have various different vyuha or different schools, and they have different ways of thinking. And this was written by 3 prominent teachers from 3 different vyuha, and they joined forces, and they came together and wrote kind of a definitive
schools of
different schools.
Styles.
It's a definitive history of karate, and one of the big, and Michael's been helping me with some of this, but one of the really interesting issues, see if I can dig it out. Okay, I don't know if you can see this, but the chapter heading, can you see that?
Yeah, the 4th chapter. I'm not quite sure how to translate it though.
Yeah, right. Well, this actually tode or todi.
Yeah, it's like
Karate. Okay, literally means Chinese hand.
Okay, I was wondering how to translate, because it's the character for the Tang Dynasty, but also for some other terms.
Well, this is what karate used to be called in Okinawa, todi, but it uses the kanji, which can actually be read as karate as well, karate. So do you translate that as todi or karate, because that was the way that it was said, but also,
or do you translate Chinese fist, or
there's a very interesting story behind how actually the kanji was changed from Chinese fist into empty hand, and I won't go into the details here because it's very long and quite involved, but my point is, it's like there is a time where even this kanji started to be called not todi but karate. Okay, so when you write it in English or in Romaji, Roman characters, it's still karate, whether it's this kanji or another kanji. But when it's in Japanese, like this, the connotations are actually quite different, and also the error is different. So this todi, the way of reading the kanji like this was popular until round about 1903, 1904, apparently. And that's when karate became kind of mainstream in the media, as in the way that it was pronounced or said. And so you're looking at, okay, so when do I start calling it karate? When do I start calling it toden? And you'll find in one chapter, it'll be jumping between periods, and it'll have different kanji here and there for the same thing. And it's like, holy crap, do I just keep calling it karate, Chinese hand, karate, empty hand, which becomes a real pain in the butt, not only for the translator, but also for the reader, right? And so you have to sort of reconcile these various problems. And I even asked the authors about this. We had a meeting at the Budokan recently, and they're going, shit, I don't know. We better work on that one. And then Corona happened, and that very problem is still in suspended animation. So there's little things like that which can really, just a simple thing, right? But that really throws a spanner in the works, because you can overthink it as well. But this is
well, it's
a history book.
Distinction used in a lot of different places, and it's a distinction with a definite meaning.
Yeah,
a strong meaning to it. Right? It's a completely different word in many ways.
That's
even
right. And it's also very loaded with kind of political sort of nuances as well, and cultural nuances, of course. So it's kind of important in a way. But even the importance of this, if you're looking at it from the perspective of a historian, which is what I am trained as, these things are actually very important. But the authors themselves, they're karate masters who have never really given it that much thought before. It's read karate. It's like, what the hell? It's the same sort of thing, but it's actually not. So as a translator, it's like, well, how do I sort of, reconcile this what I would consider to be quite an important sort of differentiation, because it is about the history of karate after all, right?
Yeah.
So that's the other thing, is sometimes you find yourself as a translator ending up trying to do you've got to be careful with this too, trying to do a much better job than the original authorship. Not that that's the case with this, but with various little articles and stuff that I've translated before. I think you're probably the same too, right, Michael? We translated stuff is like, holy crap, this is just so bad, but how do I make it better?
No comment.
We are I think close to an hour or more into this, which I'm supposed to cut us off after about 40 minutes or so. So
I thought KED talks are supposed to be 20 minutes.
So let's end here for now. But I feel like there's obviously still a lot more we could dive into in the topic of translation. We haven't touched really much on interpreting either. So let's save it for another time. So thank you guys again for recording this.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
And
thanks,
buy some of these books. These guys have put so unbelievably large amount of effort into these books. And you guys may not have seen it, but they're holding up books, and Alex is just gesticulating wildly at his background.
Apparently you have to talk so the camera can see you. So yeah.
Blah, 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 blah,
please
blah,
buy
blah.
this. Please buy this. It's very, very good. And I worked very hard on it, and it will help you, Kendo.
Yeah. I
that's okay.
You guys out there listening to better understand the sheer amount of effort it takes to do a good translation, do justice in translation.
Yeah, and also I will add, you've got to have a lot of really good friends in Japan as well who read your shit translation and fix it for you.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I'll agree with that.
It's a collaborative effort. Yeah.
It is really, seriously. All right, mate. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you guys very much.
Cheers.
Okay, see you later.
See ya.